And welcome back to an episode of the Cooley Jets podcast. We're with Ben Blessington and Michael Nania. Michael, free agency gets underway next week. How excited are you 6 days out?
Yeah, I'm really excited, and there's always excitement this time of year, most specifically for Jets fans because obviously we always have the most room to improve of any team in the league. But this year just feels different because of the unpredictability of it. There's so many possibilities, different paths that they can take to improve the team this offseason. It feels different in the sense that we don't really have any indication of what might happen, what their ideal plan is. There are just so many different directions they could take it, and that makes it really exciting. So it's always exciting, but this year is different in a lot of ways. It is an opportunity for them to really set themselves up on a sustainable path to winning for years to come. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, it feels like every offseason we say this is the most important offseason because the truth of the matter is they're all important. But in terms of aggression, you go back to Joe Douglas's first full offseason with the team. They were very conservative. Now, granted, that was the COVID spring, so maybe that had something to do with it, but they were very conservative. They didn't plug a lot of needs in free agency, a lot of stopgap 1-year contracts. Last offseason, they were a lot more aggressive. They took some swings with Corey Davis and Carl Lawson, but they were maybe, they could have been more aggressive maybe in some ways. I'm not saying that they should have been, but, they still left some holes at corner and at other spots on the roster. They wanted to keep trusting the young players, which I think was an admirable strategy and may pay off for them. This offseason, however, though, I think the expectation is that they will, I don't want to say like win now because I think that's kind of an overused term, but yeah, like more of a win now approach in terms of being comfortable filling your roster with veteran free agents and not feel like every position needs to be youthful because of a rebuild. How aggressive do you think, though, that is for Joe Douglas and the Jets when next week ultimately comes around?
It's going to be really interesting to see because even though they are fifth in cap space, I believe they don't quite have as much as they have had in recent off seasons. So, but like you said, I think it's not necessarily about being a win now team in the sense that you're trying to win a Super Bowl in 2022, but it's about, trying to plug as many holes as you can so you can have freedom in the draft and you don't have to force things there. So you can go into the season and not necessarily have to rely on young players at so many positions. Last year was a great year to do that because it was the first year of a new regime, and you're installing a new offensive and defensive scheme. So why not just get reps for so many young players, allow them to build that up? Now, a lot of guys are coming into year two this year, already having built that experience. But now in year two, you really want to supplement all those young guys and start filling out your roster and working your way back towards contention. So I think they are going to be very aggressive and use about as much of the cap space as they realistically can, because now is the year to, like I said, push those young guys forward. That core you've already built of young guys starting last year and the last few years, and push them forward and start getting the ball rolling. So I do think they are going to be pretty aggressive. And I think it's just the style of that aggression that will be interesting to see. Are they going to get two huge free agents and then, sort of fill out the roster otherwise with cheap free agents? Or are they going to, sign maybe instead of two big free agents, maybe 4 or 5 mid-tier free agents? So I think that's what is going to be the most uncertain for me right now, how they're going to disperse, spread the cap space around. But I do absolutely expect them to be aggressive in terms of the total amount of cap dollars they'll use.
Yeah, even though they have, I think it's like 48 million or 49 million, and they can free up a lot more if they do cut a few guys, and we'll get to that in a second. You have to remember they do have 2 first-round draft picks. They have a whole draft class to pay, and that includes 2 first and 2 second-round draft picks. So it's not necessarily as much money as it appears to be. But the truth of the matter is that veteran players, definitely do win games for you, do help you win games. Young players are going to be the foundation of your long-term success, but you sign a few key veterans. it might not translate to long-term success, but you look at like the 2015 Jets, who it's not like they had the greatest core in the world of a roster, but they signed a few veterans. The veterans stayed healthy and they played well. And you saw a 10-win team, and a team that actually could have made some noise in the playoffs. So it's not an amazing free agency class, in my opinion. I think it's a good free agency class. I think they can definitely improve the roster. And look, if they nail free agency and they nail the draft, there's a chance that this team could, win some games this season. But I think the expectations every year with fans, and I have to watch myself, is that you always think that you're going to land every single free agent that you're interested in. And the reality of things is that a large part of it comes down to the player himself, whether he wants to play in New York or not. It comes down to money. And then we don't really even know who the Jets want to target. So things always end up looking a little different than you imagine them. But I feel like last year, Michael, I feel like we were on the same page with Joe Douglas. I don't think he made any moves that we really didn't like. In fact, I think me and you both were very happy with the free agency period, mostly in the fact that they got Carl Lawson.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and like you said, one of the biggest things from an outsider's perspective is to understand that your team is probably not going to get every single big free agent. They're probably not going to get even one, if you're being honest.
They're going to get one free agent.
I didn't say they're not going to get one free agent, but there are a lot of teams in the league going after every Marcus Williams, Dalton Schultz, and the odds are you're not going to get them. You absolutely could, but the bottom line is keep your expectations low. And not to do a cheap plug, but that's one of the things I like about the JetX offseason simulator is you don't automatically get every free agent you sign. So it kind of forces you to adjust your plans in the middle of it. And, I'm not just going to get anybody I want. So I have to be able to pivot if I don't get Marcus Williams or whoever. So it's definitely will be interesting to see what their plan B is, because it's easy for us to sit here right now and say, okay, they need a tight end, Dalton Schultz. They need a safety, Marcus Williams, and map out this perfect plan. But it, again, doesn't always work out that way. So how they get to their plan B and their plan C and, execute those is going to be just as important as who those top targets are.
Yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what we're going to do here, because I don't think, while we can't predict exactly who they're going to land because there's too many variables, I think we can go through the likely targets. And I think if we do our job correctly today, Michael, the Jets shouldn't sign that many guys that we don't talk about on this podcast. There will obviously be a few stragglers that get signed that flew under the radar, but I think we will be talking about a lot of players today, and a good amount of them, or a few of them, I guess I should say, will be Jets by the end of next week. So
did we do that last year? Who did they sign? Anyone we didn't really talk about?
I don't
maybe
think
Justin Hardy.
Yeah, Justin Hardy was one but we talked about Corey Davis. I remember talking about Carl Lawson, because I remember you and I both agreeing that he would be the best free agent to sign. But there's no way the Bengals let him go. Corey Davis, I think we liked, but I don't think either of us had predicted the Jets to sign him. We'll be making some predictions as well. I guess I should mention that. Yeah, I guess that's a good jumping off point. Is we'll go through each position. We'll talk about the Jets roster. We'll talk about the free agency landscape. The guys we think they'll be interested in, the bargain guys, the top guys, and then we'll make some predictions in the position, and we'll just move down the positions going in the order of least important of need to most important of need. So, Michael, let's just go ahead and start with kicker, and this is least, I guess, but you could argue it should be higher given how much this position has affected the Jets' win total the last few seasons. They have Eddie Pinheiro under contract. Actually, I believe he is a free agent, but they can bring him back. He provided some stability at the end of last season, but I'm still not necessarily confident that he is the long-term solution there. What are your thoughts on the landscape at kicker?
Yeah, I think bringing Pinheiro back is something you should definitely do. I think he earned it the way he played at the end of the season, but it was only, half a season or however many games it was, only 8 field goal attempts, which is nothing you could bank on, too small of a sample size. So I think you still want competition. Matt Amendola is under contract. They sign him to a reserve future deal, I believe. So, but I think they still need to get someone else in there. And I would like to see a substantial move, not necessarily, spending a high draft pick or a big free agent, but for the most part, they've really scraped the bottom of the barrel with this position every single year. So if there's if they trade back into the seventh round and there's a kicker they like, maybe draft them. Or, there are some good, decent veteran kicker free agents out there. Joey Sly, Zane Gonzalez, Dustin Hopkins, Greg Joseph, Randy Bullock, who was a hero for the Jets this year, but he actually did have a pretty decent season outside of the obvious kick that he missed in overtime. So I would like to see them actually just put some effort into this position. So I'd bring back Pinheiro and get at least one other name with a not necessarily proven track record, but just someone with a pulse that will do.
Yeah, I do kind of wonder, kind of going back to what we were just talking about in terms of the Jets' aggression, because, and saying that veterans win games, because it does kind of make sense the last few seasons where it's like, okay, I'm not saying the Jets are trying to lose games, but they're playing their young guys. And the Jets have, you're right, they've really scraped the bottom of the barrel at the kicker position. They've made no investment at that spot, and it has cost them in multiple games over the last few seasons. So I do wonder, is now the time where it's, you are trying to win more games, you are trying to be more competitive. Do you take a swing on a guy like Younghoe Koo? You mentioned a few guys there. Joey Sly is another interesting one. Nick Folk, I think, is also a free agent, but I kind of do believe that they'll bring back Pinheiro, and I think that the draft or undrafted free agent market is where they'll ultimately bring somebody in to compete with Pinheiro. I think that is probably the most likely path the Jets take. I don't see them spending big money on a kicker, especially with all their needs and our expected amount of aggression for them this offseason. Moving ahead, though, at quarterback, and obviously starting quarterback is not a need for the Jets, but backup quarterback, Mike White is a restricted free agent. I believe they'll bring him back. Joe Flacco is a free agent. I don't know about him. I wouldn't expect them to bring him back, but then Robert Saleh did say some stuff at the end of the season that kind of alluded to maybe that they would like to bring their whole quarterback room back. So you never know. Maybe that's just coach speak. But Michael, what are your thoughts on the Jets' backup quarterback situation? Do you like their current options, or do you think they'll go out of house next week?
I feel like they're going to stay in house here. With Mike White as a restricted free agent. You could just put the original round tender on him, which I think is 2.5 million. So I think that's reasonable. I think they're just going to go with him. Flacco still on the table. I know we were talking earlier, and you said that you think they might bring back Flacco. I think they're going to go with White, but do you think Flacco has a chance to come back?
I don't think I think they're definitely gonna bring back Mike White. The only way they would bring back Flacco is if they really value his voice in the quarterback room. Um, I mean, obviously, uh, the quarterback position always gets overpaid. So I think if Flacco comes back, it's not going to be something where he gets signed next week. It would be him getting signed in like June after the draft at some point, seeing how the rest of the offseason goes. I wouldn't say it's likely, but just based off Salah's comments alone, I'll say that I wouldn't rule it out. But I think you're probably right. It's probably Zach Wilson and Mike White next year under center. But if they decide they want a veteran voice in there, Flacco, now has some experience. The other position that isn't necessarily a hole when you look at it, looking at the starter, but you want depth at this position. That's running back, and this is a position that will see a lot of snaps. Whoever they sign will play. So even though they're necessarily a backup, they'll probably will end up starting some games depending on injuries and will see a good amount of targets. Outside of Michael Carter, Michael, I think the Jets have a real opportunity to really improve this spot on the team if they do want to be a run. I'm not saying they want to be a complete run first team, but that the West Coast style, you have to be able to run the football. I think Michael Carter's awesome. Tevin Coleman provided a spark at times last year, but the injury concerns are there, and another year on the tires there. Do you think the Jets bring back Coleman, or do you think they look for an upgrade here? And even if they do bring him back, there's still a lot of free agents in that running back market that they could go after.
Yeah, I wouldn't be against bringing back Tevin Coleman, but I think, like you said, the injuries are a question mark. He's been banged up pretty often the past few years, and it's not like he's necessarily playing the most important role to where those injuries are hurting your team. So, if it's a cheap deal, then by all means. But I think there are a lot of free agent running backs out there that can bring things to the table that they don't really have. And specifically, I think about the passing game because beyond Michael Carter, who I think does have that 3-down potential, beyond him, they really struggled in the passing game last year, specifically with Ty Johnson, who was an absolute machine with drops and giving up pressures. Actually, had the most drops of any running back in the league. I believe he's tied for the third most pressures allowed. So that just can't happen. They really need help with that third down running back role. Guys who can come in and pass block and just flat out catch the ball without dropping it. And one guy who is sort of an underrated free agent because of his abilities in these areas is Malcolm Brown. He played with the Rams for a while, was with Miami last year, but didn't really play. But he is a very good pass blocker. Not going to give you much explosion at all as a running back, but he's a good short yardage power guy, which is something they didn't really have this year either in terms of like a big bodied battering ram type of running back. So I think he is an interesting guy to potentially fill some of those roles they didn't have at running back. Then you have the two 49ers connections, Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert can bring home run hitting ability. Because I think that's the one thing Michael Carter doesn't bring is I think his top end speed isn't amazing. We did see him get caught up to on a couple potential touchdowns this year, which is the one hole in his game, I would say, one major hole. So I think that they could use some more home run hitting ability. Those two guys, if healthy, can bring it, and their scheme fits as well. So I think there are some good options in terms of very cheap running backs who bring particular skills that can fit into this committee and bring things that they didn't have last year.
Yeah, they're missing a big power back, then they're missing a good third down back. And I think that third down back can also be that lightning bolt, that change of pace back that who has that getaway speed that Carter doesn't have. I think, a guy to keep an eye out for is Cordero Patterson, especially if the Jets lose Braxton Berrios. I think the Jets, LaFleur is always going to be looking for those guys who can handle the trick plays, the reverses, the fancy stuff. And Patterson did a really good job of that in Atlanta. He did a great season this past year. I still kind of think the Jets might bring back Berrios. We'll get to that a little later. But even if you ignore him, the guy that I do really like is Raheem Mostert, who I know missed last season. The injury concerns with him there as well. But I think that's an upgrade over Tevin Coleman, and the guy is going to bring you a similar skill set. If he's healthy, I think Mostert is arguably the best back in free agency. But you look at the amount of established names. I mean, this just shows you why running back is just so replaceable, because it really is the only position when you look at all these free agents where you can say how many starters are here between Sony Michel, James Conner, Melvin Gordon, Leonard Fournette, Matt Breida, Marlon Mack. I mean, so there are a few guys there that, maybe aren't high end Alvin Kamara's, but those guys can start games for you and get 100 yards, and you can be, you can survive. So I'm curious if the Jets will explore that market, especially if they're worried about how injured Tevin Coleman was, if they want somebody more reliable. I think Malcolm Brown is a great guy to throw out there. I like Raheem Mostert, but I agree with you that the pass blocking is probably the number one thing they're looking for. You can survive without a running back who has top end speed or a power running back, but a running back in pass protection is, I don't want to say a must, but extremely helpful in those third down situations. Looking ahead
before we go to the next one, I want to talk about Patterson a little bit, just quick, because it's probably not likely or anything, but it's interesting to think about because you brought up Berrios, and I think I was doing an article trying to a few weeks ago and trying to find comparisons for him contract wise, and really when you dig into it, based on what he did this past year, Berrios, he compares a lot more closely to Patterson than, like your traditional slot receivers or anybody like that. It's the versatility he brought this year that made him really unique. And he was producing at pretty much the level. Obviously, Patterson had a huge breakout year this year, but Berrios this year was pretty much exactly what Patterson was before 2021. A guy who, trick plays out of the backfield, flea flickers, big time returning, being able to run the ball in addition to being able to flex out and catch it. He was very much like that sort of role. So do you think, I don't think Patterson's going to leave. I'm pretty sure he's been open about wanting to return, but if he did become available, is he a player that for you specifically, not the Jets, would they be interested? Is that something that you would be interested in doing?
Maybe. I do kind of worry about the 1-year wonders a little bit. And I think Arthur Smith is a hell of an offensive coordinator and a guy who's going to get the most out of his players. So Cordero's not a guy I would give out big money to, but yeah, certainly I would sniff around. I think he's a talented football player. I think he, like you said, he had a breakout year this year, and the Jets have a need there. I think if Berrios leaves, though, the one silver lining is I don't think that's an incredibly hard position to fill. I mean, especially when you look at how good these receiver classes are every year in the draft. I mean, you can draft a guy in the fourth or fifth that can do a lot of those trick play things for you that Berrios would for a fraction of the price, especially when you're talking about Berrios making 8, 9, 10 million. And the same goes for Cordero Patterson. But, if you're paying, if you're going to pay a Berrios or a Patterson 5, 6, 7 million, that's a different discussion. Because I do really believe in the versatility that they bring. So if Berrios leaves, we'll see if the money's right. But I think you're right. I think Patterson goes back to Atlanta. I don't think he messes with things too much. Moving ahead to linebacker, and this is a really interesting position to me because I think they'll absolutely make a move at running back, whether it's bringing back Tevin Coleman or whatever. But linebacker has the potential to be this year's cornerback from last year, if that makes any sense whatsoever. A bit convoluted. But in the terms that people think it's a need, it probably should be a need. There are holes there, but the Jets pretty much just ignore it. Maybe they draft somebody on day 3, but they don't really make a big move here. And so they're left with, maybe an underwhelming or a more of a projection at linebacker, I guess I should say. I think linebacker certainly has that potential. Just with all the needs that the Jets have, I think linebacker is the one they could ignore. However, this scheme does require amazing linebacker play. The only reason I think they could ignore it is because you look at that coaching staff between Ulbrich and Saleh, linebackers coaches, maybe they're confident in their ability to coach up a bunch of young guys in this scheme. But there's one guy in this class. There's a few guys actually that I think would really help the Jets because I think the Gerard Davis experiment didn't really work, but they did end up finding Quincy Williams, who I don't think is a surefire, amazing player yet, but he at least provided some sort of value and maybe can develop into something more. Jared Davis, on the other hand, was awful. I think the one thing they're missing is a really, really good pass coverage linebacker. And not just that, not just pass coverage, but they got shredded in the run game. A lot of those draws and those screen plays and that short yardage stuff, a lot of that falls on the linebackers. So for me, you need a guy who's great in pass coverage and a guy who's very instinctual. And Devondre Campbell had an all-pro year last year with Green Bay. So to me, he's the guy that I would target. He's a Demario Davis type of guy for me. But at the same time, and I think he's going to get away because Green Bay has to pay Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. So assuming both Adams and Rodgers go back to Green Bay, I don't see Campbell staying. I think he'll shake free. He had an amazing season. He's a great pass coverage linebacker. I think you put him next to Mosley. I think the one reservation they would have is that they're already going to pay Mosley, $19 million, $18 million. I think if they can restructure Mosley a little bit, maybe carry his money out over the course of a few more seasons, they might be more comfortable paying Campbell a little bit, but I don't think Campbell's going to be extraordinarily expensive. Michael, what are your thoughts on the linebacker market? Because outside of Campbell, there are a lot of guys who maybe make more sense, who are maybe younger or less of a big name, but there's a lot of good linebackers this year in the free agency class.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I agree with what you said that this position can be the cornerback of this year. Or I mean, they kind of treated linebacker this way last year and didn't value it too highly. I mean, I know they made the Davis signing, but it was still just a 1-year gamble. But I think I don't see them doing anything here, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I think personally, I value linebackers more than most people do, just because of how frequently involved they are in plays, how many snaps they play, the communication role that they play. So I value linebackers pretty highly, and I think they do as well. But I think Saleh and Ulbrich are both linebacker coaches. That was their background before they really moved their way up. And they were both successful in that role, developing a lot of guys to be great players, whether it was Fred Warner for Saleh, Deion Jones for Ulbrich, even Eric Kendricks at UCLA for Ulbrich. They've both done a very good job with that. So I think they're clearly confident that they can make it work with just moldable talents, and they don't necessarily need to spend a premium draft pick to get it there. They feel like they can make it work with whatever they have. I think they clearly showed that last year with their pair of converted safety picks with Nasruddin and Sherwood. So I think that's going to continue. And then with Quincy Williams, it seems like there's a lot of positive buzz coming out of the building with him. So it really does seem like that they're cool with him being the starter next year too. And they obviously have the two developmental pieces there as well, who could potentially overtake Williams. But ultimately, there does not seem to be any indication that they're going to do anything aggressive here. But maybe they surprise us, and I think they should, because I like Williams. The potential he showed was it's exciting when he's at his best. It's as good as linebacker play can look. He hits hard, he's fast, but at the cost of that, he does, overrun a lot of screens and get washed out in the run game because he is fairly small for a linebacker. So he did give up a lot of plays for the ones he did make. So I think there's absolutely a place for him on any roster, but I think he's a guy you would like to try to upgrade over as a starter. But again, I don't think any signs point to that. But if they do decide to do it, Devondre Campbell, I think, is easily the cream of the crop. There is 1 year wonder risk with him because, he wasn't necessarily an all-pro caliber player before this year, but he was really good. And it does kind of call back to Demario Davis, who was in the exact same boat, was a decent starter for a long time, then breaks out of nowhere. The Jets didn't invest in it. The Saints did. And it turned out that he did maintain that late career breakout. And Davis is still a great player. So Campbell could do the same thing. There is the connection with Jeff Ulbrich, who we played under in Atlanta for 4 years. So I think he makes a lot of sense if they do want to make an investment at linebacker. I don't feel like they will, but if they do, he makes sense. But beyond him, they want to look at cheaper options. There are a lot of, and it feels like linebackers should be cheap because last year there were some good options. Jayon Brown, Nicholas Morrow, a couple of guys who seem like they're going to get paid a lot of money, but most of them just got cheap 1 year deals. The league isn't really valuing linebacker that much on the open market. So if they want someone cheaper, there's Aluakon from the Falcons, who led the league in tackles this year. It's a little misleading, but he's a decent starter, good athlete. Falcons connection with Ulbrich. Keanu Neal, who they were in the mix for last year, converted from safety, played in Atlanta too. Jayon Brown is a free agent again. He was hurt last year, but he's a talented coverage linebacker. Christian Kirksey, Aziz Al-Shaair, San Francisco connection, sub-package linebacker. So there are some good budget options at linebacker too.
Yeah, there's a few guys with connections to Ulbrich and Salah. The interesting thing about Campbell, and you mentioned him having a connection with Ulbrich, do you think is it almost a negative that he had the overrep with Ulbrich and then immediately after that has the breakout year, being away from the system that Ulbrich is running? Do you think that maybe minimizes the chances that Campbell would sign here?
I think so. He did also play at the Cardinals too, in between the two teams.
That's fair.
That's interesting to think about because it probably has a lot more to do with like the personal connection more so than the production. So like we don't know. Maybe he hates Jeff Ulbrich. Maybe he loves him. We don't know. So, but it's just something that's always interesting to note.
Yeah, I think a move here makes a lot of sense because I think they could address it in the draft. There are a few guys, I'm sure they maybe liked a few guys at the Senior Bowl. They could take a swing on one of them on day 3. But I just feel like another veteran linebacker would be very big for this defense. I feel like they had a lot of mental mistakes with the linebackers and safeties, and a lot of that, in my opinion, was due to the youth and inexperience. So even if it's not Campbell, even if it's a Keanu Neal or an Aziz Al-Shaair and a Aluakon or a Quan Alexander, somebody, I think if you get some experience next to Mosley, particularly in pass coverage, I think that'll help out the entirety of the defense just because, like you said, they're involved with so much. Another position on the defense that affects everything is defensive tackle, and especially in this system because we know how much Saleh and Ulbrich love to rotate their defensive linemen. Right now, Foley Fatukasi, Nathan Shepard, doesn't seem like either of them are coming back. We'll see on that, though. And there are a lot of good defensive tackle free agents. I think the only thing that is holding me back from committing to any of them is that it's an even better defensive tackle draft class. So if you have a hole here, maybe you just wait and get a young guy, on day 2 or day 3 of the draft. Michael, when you look at defensive tackle for the Jets, what do they do here? And I guess you can even throw in a bit of a John Franklin Myers discussion here. Is he a defensive tackle? You got the Quincy Williams contract situation looming. Do you let a good player like Fatukasi walk out the door? Do you pursue any of these free agents like Ogunjobi from Cincinnati, Sheldon Richardson return. I think the Dominican Sue is a free agent. Or do you look more towards the draft class to upgrade the interior of your defensive line?
This is going to be a very interesting position to watch. I mean, everything's interesting, but we say that about everything. This is interesting. That's interesting, but this I think is intriguing in the sense of just the range of possibilities. They could do nothing here, bring back Fatukasi and just chug right along, or they could cut Rankins, let Fatukasi go, and add a free agent, draft a defensive tackle surprisingly high. So this is a position where I think that we're going to see like a mid-tier sort of free agent move, like the sort of player where I think you're going to let Fatukasi go and sort of use that similar amount of cap space to find his replacement, like a better scheme fit, a player who can maybe provide a little more pass rush at the same time. So there are two guys, and I did an article about it recently, but there are two guys who I think really check the box tremendously if they let Fatukasi go. DJ Jones from the 49ers and BJ Hill from the Bengals. Both guys are fantastic run defenders. They were elite in terms of picking up run stops last year. Jones has 4 years of experience under Saleh, has shown he could do it in a 4-3 scheme, which I think is the question with Fatukasi, because he is by no means bad this year, but he rose to prominence, the previous couple of years, and they weren't necessarily a straight up 3-4. It was more of a hybrid scheme, but either way, he did a lot more two gapping under Greg Williams, just eating up space, not necessarily focusing on penetrating. This year, they were doing a lot more penetrating and attacking, and it wasn't a great fit for him. And he was more, okay to solid than he was great the previous 2 years. Whereas a guy like DJ Jones and BJ Hill, they've shown you that they could stop the run effectively in this scheme. And both of them, I think, provide solid pass rushing as well. So I think a move like that makes sense. Letting Fatukasi walk and finding a better scheme fit for this defense, and maybe potentially providing a little more pass rush as well. But you mentioned a couple other guys. Sheldon Richardson, I think, checks this box. It would be crazy to have him back after all these years, but it definitely would make sense, I think, from a pure player fit. Larry Ogunjobi, a productive defensive tackle. Quentin Jefferson and Malik Collins are two guys who are less so on the run defense side, more about pass rushing. I think they could help there. And Sheldon Rankins is a factor in this. I don't think Rankins gets cut. I personally would take the $5.5 million in savings. I think he struggled last year, and they could probably find an upgrade, but I don't think he will, just because it seems like he has a great presence in that locker room. And it was an outlier year, so I think he will have a decent chance of bouncing back, even though he struggled this year. So I think he's going to stay. I would cut him, but I expect him to be back. So I think it's more so about Fatukasi is going to walk, and you want to replace him with someone who could stop the run in the scheme. I think DJ Jones, BJ Hill help you do that.
Yeah, if you ignore last year, if you put Rankins on this free agent market, you could make it a case that he's the best guy there. But this past year, yeah, it wasn't good for Rankins. He certainly underperformed and was a huge problem in the run game. I think he's certainly still a candidate to get cut. If they need extra money, he's a guy. If they draft 2 defensive tackles, he'll get cut. If they really do like a guy like Larry Ogunjobi, he'll get cut. But like you said, at the end of the day, I think he's probably still on the team. And look, Joe Douglas has not been quick to cut guys who are underperforming their contracts. You look at a guy like Ryan Griffin, the fact that he's still been on the team the last few seasons, or even Greg Van Roten, George Fant and Conor McGovern, they kind of earned their contracts a little bit, but they underperformed from a number perspective. But Joe Douglas has not been quick to release guys. So it wouldn't surprise me that even if Sheldon Rankins were to get cut, maybe it doesn't happen until free agency, and then they just roll that money over, or free agency training camp, and then they would roll that money over. So I don't think Sheldon gets cut next week, and because of that, I don't think they go and sign a defensive tackle. I do think that they go make a move here during the draft, as early as the second round. I mean, there's a less than 2% chance that they would explore it at 10, but I don't think that's we're not going to discuss that. But at 35 and 38, I think it's still probably a little early, but if the right guy, falls, I could see them going that direction. But this is the free agency podcast. That's a discussion for another day. But I think overall, I don't think they signed somebody here. Ogunjobi's the only one that I would maybe consider. But I think they'll trust Jonathan Marshall and the draft class to be that run stopping defensive tackle. But yeah, that is certainly a position they're going to make a move at somewhere because we know how much they love the rotation. And then looking at edge, just moving right alongside the defensive line, I think this could arguably be higher. But when you look at it from a free agency perspective, I think this is probably a position that gets addressed during the draft. So it's a little lower. Because I think the Jets addressed this in the draft, I don't think they're going to go with a high price defensive free agent here. But Michael, I do think some of those bargain guys in the edge market could, interest the Jets because of that rotation. They signed Vinnie Curry last year to be that veteran rotational edge piece. But obviously he got injured before the season started. They do have Bryce Huff. Carl Lawson's returning from injury. They have John Franklin Myers. I expect them to draft somebody early on. Do you think they signed somebody here?
Yeah, I think, like you said, in terms of the free agency big board, I think edge is pretty low, just because it's sort of a luxury need in the sense that perfect world, Carl Lawson plays back to his old talent level. Franklin Myers played pretty well last year. There are positions that are bigger holes than this, but it's also the most important position in this defense. And Franklin Myers offers that flexibility, which we didn't talk about with the defensive tackles, but we can hit now. Offers that flexibility to go back inside and maybe play, I think, at an even higher level as an interior defender than on the edge. So you have an opportunity to upgrade over him on the edge and then upgrade on the interior by pushing him inside. So it's absolutely huge need, but I think because of the draft talent, especially after this combine where the edge guys just absolutely tore it up. It's a deep, strong class. It's got talent at the top. It's got depth that'll get there to the number 10, to the 10th pick. So I think it's something that you could feel very confident about upgrading in the draft with one of those 2 first-round picks. And again, they have bigger holes to fill. Like edge, they can get a lot better, add a lot more value, but it's not a hole. Like it's right now. Yeah, if everyone's healthy, probably the strongest position on the team, one of them. But obviously they can go a lot further. But because of that, I think the cap space is better used on positions where you absolutely have to get better, like positions we'll get to, such as safety, tight end, even wide receiver. So I don't think it's something they'll spend big on, even though they are older, but I mean, Von Miller, Chandler Jones, then on the younger side, Hassan Reddick, Harold Landry, Emmanuel Agba, but I don't think they'll be in the mix for any of those guys. But as you said, there are some bargain guys who I think could add into that rotation pretty nicely. Last year, they signed Vinnie Curry, which I thought was an amazing signing. I was excited to watch him be a situational pass rusher for them. Obviously, he was unable to suit up, but there are more of those Vinnie Curry type guys this year. Solomon Thomas, I think, is a good rotational player. Obviously didn't fulfill his potential, but I think another solid guy would think can fit in pretty well as a defensive end in this scheme. Mario Addison, veteran player, still a good pass rusher. And one guy who I highlighted in an article recently talking about the run defense, who I think could help them a lot in that area because they did struggle with edge setting last year against the run. Dorrance Armstrong from the Cowboys is an excellent run defender on the edge. So I think they're looking for that. He's an interesting player to target. So I don't expect anything big here in free agency. I would say they sign maybe one rotational guy. Even that's questionable just because they do have Bryce Huff. They could resign Kyle Phillips. Although Kyle Phillips is a free agent. So I think we'll see one low tier signing at edge.
Yeah, I think that's a safe bet. This is the one position that I think Solomon Thomas is a good bet because of the solid connection. But outside of that, this is the one position that I really don't know exactly where they're going to go. But whoever they feel confident to win their one-on-ones, just pure pass pressure from a veteran, I think that's who they're going to go after. I don't think they go. Justin Houston would fit that, but he's a little old in my opinion. I think Yeah, I think Solomon Thomas makes sense. Maybe they go younger, try to throw a shot at a projection guy like Tack McKinley, but it's just such a good class, and they have a ton of picks that it wouldn't surprise me if they sign no edges in free agency and then maybe double dip in the draft, but because it's just that deep. So yeah, as far as edge and free agency, I don't think it's a huge priority. But tight end, on the other hand, I think definitely is. I think tight end is the position where, at the very least, they were going to make one move, but they probably should make two. They should probably sign somebody and draft somebody as well. And there's a lot of good tight ends. We're recording this Monday night, so David Njoku got tagged today. It sounds like Dalton Schultz and Mike Gesicki are going to get tagged. So the tight end market is shrinking. We have seen the fact that Njoku got the franchise tag is astounding. And you could talk about that for a second. But it seems like the contracts for tight ends is just getting higher and higher, and it's a clear need for the team. They have a free agent in Tyler Kroft. They could bring him back, but I think for me, the guy that really stands out to me is Hayden Hurst. He's the one that I think at this point I'd really like them to sign and then draft a guy like McBride or Ruckert or whoever to pair alongside him, because I like Hurst's effort as a blocker. I like his production. He's been overshadowed a little bit by Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts, but he's still a very good tight end who has starting experience. I think he fits the mold, and I don't think he's going to be too expensive. But even outside of him, there are plenty other good fits in free agency.
Tight end is looking really interesting. I talked earlier about
another interesting position.
Did I say interesting?
Yes, you did.
Again, I just kind of dove right into it. I got to find a new adjective to express the idea of something being intriguing. There we go, intriguing. Another I word. But I talked before about linebacker last year, how that market was surprisingly cheap last year. Tight end this year is looking like the opposite. It started a few weeks ago. Ian Thomas with the Panthers, pure blocking tight end, 0 touchdowns in 17 games last year, signed a 3-year deal for $16.5 million as a pure blocking tight end with no receiving ability. And now Njoku, on a Browns team that already has Austin Hooper on a $13+ million cap hit this year, which they can't get out of, gets franchise tagged after not even getting 500 yards last year. So this market is looking like it's going to be very expensive, which is not ideal for a Jets team that needs a lot of help here and probably needs not necessarily 2 starters, but 2 players. So Njoku would have been a great target, but he's off the board. You mentioned Hayden Hurst. I think he's a guy who fits the bill, hasn't really gotten that opportunity to shine. Kyle Pitts in Atlanta now. He's in Baltimore where he shared the spotlight with other guys, but a talented guy who I think provides two-way ability and could maybe shine with more opportunities. But Max Williams, I think, is a great target from the Cardinals, guy who's an outstanding blocker. And last year, before he got injured, and he is coming off of a major injury, I believe it's an ACL. So that's a question mark. But before he got injured last year, he was catching the ball at a high level too. But primarily you signed him for being one of the best blocking tight ends in the league. Mo Alley Cox, another guy who kind of has that two-way blocking, catching ability. But Gerald Everett, great yak guy, wasn't it? Almost said it again. Almost said interesting again. Was a exciting target for the Jets last year. He's a free agent again, has the yak to fit the scheme. He's one of the best yak tight ends in terms of just forcing missed tackles and getting yak. But he would be, from a pass catching standpoint, a good target. But if you're not getting Dalton Schultz, it's just a lot of tight end 2 kind of guys. CJ Uzama is probably going to make a lot of money. Zach Ertz, I think, is too old, kind of on the downturn. Tyler Conklin, good receiving option, but another guy who put up like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, do you think they bring back Kroft? Because I'm wondering, because all these guys sound like tight end number 2s, and I think Kroft kind of fits into that group a little bit, maybe on the lower side. So if they're going to sign a tight end number 2, do you bring back Kroft, or is this either or type of thing in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, like, Kroft is exactly what you want in a tight end 2, really. I mean, he was hurt this year and kind of played below his standards, but he brings what you want. I feel like, solid above average blocking, decent receiving. I think durability is a big issue with him. He's missed at least 5 games in 4 straight seasons. So that makes him tough to rely on. But I think there are guys with more upside. Like I'd prefer Max Williams, uh, Gerald Everett, but Hayden Hurst. So I think there are some upgrades, but ultimately it's if you're not from a Jets perspective, Mike Gesicki is a great receiver. I just don't think he fits what they need in terms of blocking and lining up in line. So from the Jets perspective, if you're not getting Dalton Schultz, it's a lot of tight end two sort of guys. So I think they just got to find two guys who they think complement each other and can
Yeah.
fill the holes in the depth chart prior to the draft. I think definitely draft one, but you want to at least just know you have two reliable players there going into the draft.
Yeah, I think Hurst makes the most sense. I'm pretty. I don't want to say confident because, as you said, it all comes down to the player. But I think I'm pretty confident that that's a player that Joe Douglas is going to be sniffing around. I think he makes too much sense. But if not, I think Max Williams is a great target. You point out. I think Mo Alley Cox had a lot of success, like you said, and Gerald Everett. I think those are all good names to keep an eye out on. But Hurst leading the pack for me. Because I don't think at this point spending big. I don't think Schultz even hits the open market, but spending big money on him at this point doesn't seem as intriguing. And it seems like every year there's a good tight end in free agency. So I think you can be a little patient here if you don't get uh, the guy you're necessarily looking for. At corner, this is the position that I think everybody thought the Jets would sign or draft at last year. They didn't do anything except draft a few guys day 3. There's a few guys in the open market here. The draft is looming. People don't really know. It's hard to get a read on how much the Jets value corner, and we'll learn a lot because this really is the first team that Douglas has assembled where you can really get a feel on what he truly believes in the type of team that he put together. Because I'm not saying the first 2 years don't count, but there was always the talk of, oh, well, they have 2 draft picks from the Jamal Adams trade, and let's see, he's rebuilding the team. This is the first year where they're really going to have a team in Douglas's full vision. And I think corner is part of that. If you listen to DJ Bieniemy, he believes that the Jets think corner is a premium position. Most people seem to think that. And it's a good free agency class, including a guy in JC Jackson, who has been an absolute killer against the Jets. Zach Wilson even called him, I think he was on the Michael Kay show, and they asked him, who the best player he played against was. And he mentioned JC Jackson as being incredible. So not just J.C. Jackson, a lot of other guys, Carlton Davis, Stephon Gilmore. So, Michael, what do you think the Jets do here at corner? I think the only guy they have that's a free agent on their end is Javelin Guidry, who I do think they should bring back. But outside of that, do you think they sign a veteran here, or do you think they just roll into the draft and keep trying to build up the youth movement in their secondary?
This is definitely, I think, the biggest domino to fall out of any position. This is where all of the philosophies of Douglas and Saleh are going to be tested, and we'll see how malleable they are, or if they're really going to stick rigidly to some of the philosophies they talked about. Because Saleh even said it quite explicitly in an interview at the beginning of the combine, and he said, he wasn't referring to cornerback, but he said reiterated what he's talked about a lot, that he thinks it's front to back league that starts in the trenches and they help everyone else more so than the other way around. So we know that they're defensive line, offensive line first sort of guys. Last year, cornerback was a need. They did nothing except draft a couple of day 3 picks, 0 signings in free agency. So it's going to be very telling, I think. This is what's going to dictate the rest of the offseason, I think, is their approach at cornerback, because it's something that they could do very little at, or it's a position that they can make a huge move at, because either one would be justified. Because you can say that they need a huge move because, look, they gave it the second highest passer rating of any team in the league last year. Their corners combined for 2 interceptions. So you could obviously justify a huge move, but at the same time, you could say that those guys are young. They held their own decently. They've experience in this scheme. This is a defense that's based on the pass rush, and if you get that humming, then the secondary is going to benefit. So you could make the argument either way, and it will be it's going to dictate everything else what they do corner. So in free agency, there are some top tier options. I think J.C. Jackson is going to probably get the biggest deal for a cornerback, or at least right around Jalen Ramsey's deal at $20 million a year. Stephon Gilmore's up there, probably not going to be at that range now that he's in his 30s, but he can still play at a high level, should make a lot of money. Carlton Davis is, I think, a guy who should be not quite on Jackson's level, but he's going to get a big deal in his prime, consistently makes a ton of plays on the football. So there are opportunities for them to substantially upgrade the cornerback position. I don't really have an indication of what they're going to do, because I feel like their historical philosophies, Douglas and Saleh, point them to not make a big free agent signing a cornerback. But like DJ told us on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, it does seem like that it is something they might consider this year, and it is a position of pretty great need. They do have potential with the young guys they have, but until that potential is fulfilled, it is a position of need. So I don't really have an inclination right now of what they're going to do, but what do you think? Would you put money on it right now? Or not necessarily, let's not be Calvin Ridley here, but do you feel confident that what were you leaning? Do you think they're going to, what do you think
I'll
they're
help you out. I'll help you out
with the cornerbacks and free agency?
Right.
Help me out.
I just wanted you to struggle a little bit more there. I think they'll address this in the draft, and we've been off for the last few weeks, so I don't know if I said in the podcast maybe a few weeks ago, but I know I texted you weeks ago before anybody else was talking about this. I said, I really think Sauce Gardner is in consideration at 4 here.
You did,
and now everybody's coming around, so I'm happy about that, because I do think that it's either going to be Kayvon Thibodeau or Aiden Hutchinson. Either they take one of the top edges, and if they don't, let's say the top goes Ike Ekwonu, Aiden Hutchinson, and Kayvon Thibodeau. I don't think they go Evan Neal. I think they could look to trade down. They could look at a guy like Trayvon Walker or Jermaine Johnson, or they could go with Sauce Gardner, who I think checks a lot of boxes for them. And I know this is the free agency podcast, but you had a great tweet about this. When you look at historic production, not only on tape, but analytically, you look at his body type, what he just put up in the 40-yard dash. So his analytics are amazing. His film has been amazing. He's a high character guy. He showed up, he played big competition this year. He led Cincinnati's defense to the college football playoffs. I mean, I think he's everything you'd look for, and he's at a premium position in cornerback, and it's a huge need. So I think there's a lot of reasons to like Sauce Gardner at 4. I think when you walk out of the draft, you want to walk out of there with players you love, and I think Sauce Gardner is certainly one of those players that a lot of teams can fall in love with. And he's also one of those players that I think you can look back and say, how did people pass on him? Because he is built exactly like Antonio Cromartie, and there's not a lot of those guys that come out. I still remember that Mike Tannenbaum clip in Hard Knocks where he's watching Cromartie in training camp. He's like, where do you even find guys like that? Well, Sauce Gardner is another one of those guys, and they're very rare. So I think there's a chance to take him at 4. If they go with Hutchinson or Thibodeau or whatever, and they take an edge at 4, I still think there's a chance that Sauce lasts till 10. I don't think he'd last much longer. I don't think it's a shoo-in that'll last till 10. I think a team could even trade up for him. But even if not, the Giants are a threat. The Broncos are a potential threat. I could maybe even see the Falcons taking him. So he's not a home run there, but there's still Stingley, there's McDuffie, there's other options in the draft. So I think that's probably what they're going to do. I think they're going to go into the draft with the plan of drafting a corner in the first 2 days. I think they'll try to target Sauce at either 4 or 10. And so for that reason, I don't think they go after J.C. Jackson. He has some good numbers in zone, but he is a largely man corner, and he does tend to get beat. I think, look, you sniff around, just see if you would even be interested in it, if J.C. Jackson would entertain it, see what the numbers are. But I don't think Joe Douglas is the GM to give J.C. Jackson a record-setting contract. However, I wouldn't hate to continue the tradition of stealing from New England and vice versa. I think a realistic target for them, if they want to bring in a veteran, is a guy like Xavier Rhodes. I think that's a guy who good in zone coverage, veteran, shouldn't be too expensive, can start games for you. I think that's a guy that makes sense. But I also think, or another guy is Rasul Douglas, who had a lot of success this year. And he's a guy who's been linked to the Jets for a long time because apparently Joe Douglas loved him and nothing's come of it. And then Douglas this year had a great year. So I think he's another guy to keep an eye out for. But I do think there's a chance that they don't do really anything um, outside of maybe a small move. And then they draft, let's say they draft a guy like Sauce Gardner and they roll in next year with Sauce Gardner, Bryce Hall, Michael Carter II. You got Guidry. I guess you'd want another I got Eccles, and I guess you'd want another corner. So I think they'll probably sign somebody, but I think it'll be maybe on the lower end of things. Just somebody to provide them some depth. So Xavier Rhodes or Douglas makes sense to me.
I agree with you. I think that's probably where I'm leaning. That it's just going to be an extra body to compete, probably a more experienced one. But that's where I'm leaning. But at the same time, I think there is a realistic chance that they do make a play for a starter.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule it out. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think they could make a move for Gilmore. I think a lot of the guys are more man coverage guys between Gilmore and Carlton Davis. Darius Williams is pretty small, and it's not like he had an amazing year. Yeah, I don't know. Jackson's the big domino. I don't see Joe Douglas being the GM to pay, but I wouldn't discount it. Part of the reason I think they're not going to go big at corners, I think they're going to go big at offensive line, and that's where I guess we're going to go to next. I think the Jets are going to spend some money this free agency, and I think a lot of it is going to be on the O-line because there's a lot of talent here, and the Jets have an opportunity to really, when you look back to when Joe Douglas took over and we saw, okay, Joe Douglas wants to turn the Jets into having, at that point, the worst, if not probably the worst offensive line in the league, and he wants to turn them into one of the best. The Jets have a real opportunity to do that if everything goes their way this offseason. And I think it starts with free agency. To me, and we can get in some of the other names, obviously they could bring back a Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. I wouldn't hate that. They have a few other free agents like Morgan Moses and Dan Feeney. But what I would do is the number one guy I'm chasing, James Daniels, guard from the Chicago Bears, who has experience in his own blocking system. He's only 24 years old. You might be asking yourself, how could he get shake free from Chicago when they've had some offensive line issues and they're trying to build around Justin Fields? They don't have a lot of cap, and they could take the money to spend on a guard and try to spread it around throughout their roster. I think and I don't think they're going to put the franchise tag on him because it's like $16 million or something. So and even the transition tag is like 15. So I think there's a really good chance that he's going to hit free agency. I think he probably returns to Chicago, but there's a chance to really steal him here. And I would not be surprised to see Joe Douglas pay up for him. Joe Douglas is fully prepared to pay for Joe Thuney. And not that James Daniels is on his level, but he's 24 years old, is a good scheme fit, fills a position of need. I would not be surprised to see Joe Douglas, maybe drop some money there. If he misses out on Daniels, Laken Tomlinson from San Francisco, experiencing the same scheme, he's another guy to keep an eye out for. Austin Corbett, Brandon Scherf. So I think there's a great guard market, and I think they're going to sign one of those top guys that I just mentioned. And then in addition to that, I think they could explore the center market as well. I don't love Conor McGovern. I still think there's about a 50% chance he's the Jets starting center next year because – look, he has chemistry with the offensive line. You imagine that counts for something. Maybe they'll get better. He's been solid. He had a better year this year than last year, but I still feel like every game I watch, he makes a play or two that really just kills a drive or a play. So I'm not a huge Conor McGovern fan. I know you're not a huge fan of the centers, Michael, in free agency. Ryan Jensen is the guy that the Jets have been linked to. I wouldn't hate that at all. I'd be all on board on that. We've heard Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh talk about wanting to become more of a bully up front, and Ryan Jensen's one of the biggest bullies in the league. So for me, in my ideal world, I'd sign Ryan Jensen, and then I'd sign a guy like James Daniels. And if you miss on Daniels, you pivot to one of the other guards. And then I think you look at that offensive line of Fant, AVT, Jensen, Daniels, and Becton, and I think you're very happy with that heading into the draft. So Michael, what are your thoughts on the Jets' offensive line prospects in free agency?
So first with center, I think Ryan Jensen is the crown jewel of the center class. And if you can get him then I think you should absolutely go for it because you can release McGovern and get uh, quite a bit of savings. 9 million they would clear up by cutting him. So if you can sign Jensen to whatever he gets, 10, 11, 12 million for a few years as a guy who's into his 30s now, then I think that's something you do. A guy with championship experience, probably the most notoriously nasty offensive lineman in the league right now. So checks that box for Douglas. And look, aside from that, is a good player. He's able to, I think he's scheme versatile, good pass blocker, absolute mauler in the run game. So if you can get him, then I think by all means you can let McGovern go and make that upgrade for only a small change in cap compared to McGovern. So, but outside of that, I think the rest of the centers are lateral moves. So I would just stick with McGovern unless you can get Jensen. But the guard market is there are a lot of options here. I think this is why I'm hesitant to, as much as I like Ekwonu, I'm hesitant to mock him to the Jets at 4 right now, just because I feel like the guard spot is going to be filled before we get to the draft. So like Laken Tomlinson with the 49ers, scheme fit, experience with Mike LaFleur, solid pass blocker, good mover in the run game. James Daniels, you mentioned, zone fit. He actually had a pretty rough pass blocking season this past year, but it was an outlier compared to the previous few years. He's blocking for Justin Fields, who holds the ball a long time. So great option, specifically in the run game. And he's very young too. He's not even 25 yet. I'm not in on Brandon Scherf. Too injury prone for me. I don't think he's worth the cap space with how consistently injured he is. So I would pass on that, but I could see them making a play. And then beyond that, one guy who I think is pretty underrated is Conor Williams from the Cowboys, a guy who committed a ton of penalties last year. So that's obviously a concern, not to overlook that. But his pass blocking numbers were outstanding. He gave up the third lowest pressure rate among all guards in the league. So it's not something to overlook. And
is that because he's holding every play?
It could be a part of it, but what I was going to say is that the penalties were an outlier compared to the first few years of his career. He was a very normal penalty guy, and this year everyone on the Cowboys was committing more penalties, so it wasn't just him. So I like him as an under the radar guard option, but I think there are quite a few opportunities to improve the offensive line, round it out before you get to the draft.
Fully agreed. Two more positions here, Michael. I agree with everything you said on O-line. The other thing is they could sign another guy for depth. I think Dan Feeney, I'd like to bring him back. I thought he got a lot better as the year went on. Tackle depth is the one thing to maybe keep an eye out for. I think that probably the draft, because they're already paying Fant and they have Becton. They'll probably draft a tackle to have behind them, but I could see Morgan Moses coming back. But that's just something to keep an eye out for, just given Becton's injury issues and that whole situation there. I think they'll probably make a move at tackle, but that could be in April. Two more positions though. Safety we'll start with. What do the Jets do here? There's a lot of good safeties in the market. Jesse Bates is just got franchise tagged today. So Marcus Williams is probably far and away the top safety on the open market. Quandre Diggs is another guy who's gathered a lot of buzz. Tyrann Mathieu, I've seen some people tweet about. So, Michael, where do you think the Jets should go here with the safety position?
I think Marcus Williams is probably, of all the free agents at any position, probably the best player for them to just, market opens. That's your guy who you're chasing after. He checks all the boxes. Huge position of need in his prime, durable, consistent elite production over multiple years. Scheme fit. He really has everything that I think that they need, and more so than any other free agent on this market. There's really no reason not to like the idea of signing him, even to a deal that will potentially make him a top 5 highest paid player at his position. So Marcus Williams, for sure they should go after him. But if they don't get Williams, I think there are some great fallbacks. I don't think they should go after Tyrann Mathieu. I think he's a good player, but he's into his 30s, a little bit more hype than substance when you look at his advanced numbers. He's, again, good, but not necessarily great like he might be paid. So I would pass on him. But if you don't get Marcus Williams, they have a lot of options to get one, even two starters to hold this position down before the draft. Quandre Diggs, the Seahawks, experience in the same, defensive coaching tree, playing in Seattle, consistent interception guy, 3+ picks in the last 5 years, each of the last 5 years. Guy who is a little bit on the older side. He's going to be 29 this year, but still playing at a high level. I think he's a good fallback. Then beyond him, Jayon Brown, Xavier Woods, Jordan Whitehead, Jaquiski Tart, Terrell Edmonds, Justin Reed. There are a lot of solid to decent, starters out there who can hold the fort down for you at what should be an affordable price. So the Jets, I think this is a position where you go after Marcus Williams aggressively. Hopefully you can net him. But if not, they have a lot of very solid options to get the placeholder starters that they need. And not even necessarily placeholders, because I think some of these players are legitimately pretty good. Jayon Brown had a good season for the Cowboys last year as a box safety, making plays in coverage as a box safety. Xavier Woods, solid player. Jordan Whitehead is an underrated young player who makes a lot of splashy plays. Tart has 49ers and solid experience. So there's this is a good market at safety, and it's a position of need for the Jets. So they have an opportunity to make some noise here.
Yeah, I think they're absolutely going to sign one guy. And Marcus Williams makes a ton of sense in the world. But it's really possible they could sign two. I really think they could go with one guy, maybe a big guy like Marcus Williams, then a guy like Jaquiski Tart, or just two middle of the road guys. But it's a good class, and I think it makes. I like the idea of having veteran safeties, just because that is a position that really. I mean, Ashton Davis has struggled. The Jets have used a lot of youth there, and part of the reason is just it's a position that requires experience. In my eyes, I think you really requires good reaction time. To be able to read what's happening and be instinctual enough. It's hard to do this as a rookie. It was impressive, the type of season that Marcus May and Jamal Adams had. But if you remember, that was a question mark going to the year to have two rookie safeties. I like if the Jets are going to go young at corner, go with the experience at safety. You still have guys like Jason Pinnock and Ashton Davis on the roster. You could still draft somebody to have some depth, some youth and depth at that position. But I don't think you mess around here. I think you go and get a Marcus Williams, or go get a Quandre Diggs, go get a Jaquiski Tart. Just bring some veterans into the building and put them in the back, because we've just seen too many blown deep balls, and a lot of that's due to the safety play. And I think if the Jets had some veterans back there, a good safety play back there, you wouldn't see that as much. It's a combination of the corner and safety play, but when I look at the corner market in free agency and I look at the safety market in free agency, I think the safeties have the considerable edge, especially when you factor how much each is going to cost. Which, Michael, that brings us to our last position, and that's wide receiver, which is another position where the Jets we'll learn a lot about their draft plans, I guess. The Jets could either make a big move here and push receiver down their draft board, or they could make no move here, in which case receiver could be an option at 4. What do you think they end up ultimately doing? Braxton Berrios is the big receiver, the big free agent of their own at this position. They also have Keelan Cole. DJ Bieniemy reported today that it sounds like Jamison Crowder is going to walk. That shouldn't be news to anybody. But outside of those guys, there's a lot of talent on this open market. So where do you see Joe Douglas going next week here?
Well, this was definitely an interesting day to potentially take a couple options out of play for the Jets, with Chris Godwin maybe being tagged. There was a report that they would, but there's also another report that said it's not a 100% that he'll be tagged. But let's just assume for now that Godwin will be tagged. Then that definitely takes a great option off the table. And then Calvin Ridley, not a free agent, but potential trade option. He's suspended for the year, so that's off the table as well. So this position has become with those two new pieces of news, the one of the most puzzling ones to figure out what they're going to do, because I've sort of been debating this in terms of, what is the best way to go about this, because I want to get a veteran, reliable. This is a position where I want to get reliable players more so than rely on the draft, because you want to supplement Zach Wilson as much as possible. So you want to raise the floor and not risk, okay, let's rely on a rookie. And he could be Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson, but he could also be Jalen Rager or Laquan Treadwell or Kevin White. So that's why I would like to be able to add as much proven talent at this position as possible. But at the same time, do you want to invest a ton of money into a mid-tier option like a Christian Kirk, Michael Gallup, DJ Chark, Mike Williams, whoever it may be, guys who are good players, but do you want to invest a ton of cap space to, complete your wide receiver core without a true superstar in it, which Elijah Moore could potentially be, but we don't know that yet. So it's tough to figure it out. You can make the case for making that sort of move. Like, let's just round it out with another very good player. You got a nice, solid trio with Elijah Moore, Corey Davis, and fill in the blanks with your favorite receiver. There are a lot of good, solid options. But without those two guys available and Davante Adams, who knows what's going on with him? Amari Cooper could come into the mix, and then he'd be the top dog. But not a ton of options for that superstar number one receiver. So do you feel comfortable filling out your receiver room with a mid-tier option, or do you bypass it and then take the risk, but also the higher ceiling option of waiting till the draft? You get Drake London, Garrett Wilson, whoever it may be, and that guy is cheaper. He could have a higher ceiling than whoever you might sign, but there's also the risk that maybe this guy takes a long time to develop, or he's flat out bad, and now you don't have an upgrade for your second year quarterback. So it's going to be probably the toughest decision this offseason, how to handle the wide receiver position. Do you go for something safer in free agency, but limit your ceiling and also spend a lot of cap money on it? Or do you shoot for the moon, but also take a risk by waiting for the draft? This is a tough one to figure out. What do you think they ultimately do here?
I think they'll address receiver in the draft. I can't see Joe Douglas shelling away $20 million for Amari Cooper. And when I look at the rest of the market, I mean, obviously Devontae Adams is the dream. I don't think he shakes out of Green Bay. I think Chris Godwin returns to Tampa Bay. Allen Robinson has been a free agent, I swear, every year for the last 5 years, and he's not left yet. I would be interested in him. I don't know how much of a scheme fit he is, but I think he would be the exact type of receiver that Zach Wilson is really missing. Same thing kind of goes for Mike Williams, but Williams, if he didn't have the injury issues, I'd be maybe more interested in him. But with how often he's injured, I don't see them pursuing him. Same thing goes for Cooper. Injury times money. Sounds like Gallup's going to go back to Dallas. Beckham's probably going back to LA. So yeah, then you're just left with like, okay, Juju Smith-Schuster, Christian Kirk, Russell Gage. I just don't see them going with anybody there. I think they could sign a guy to replace Keelan Cole. They could make an upgrade there. But the one thing about Keelan Cole is he can block, and that does matter. He did have a few nice blocks this year that sprung some runs. He can block. He knows the offense. He has some chemistry with Zach Wilson. So, if they bring back Berrios, they bring back Cole, and they go and draft a guy, that makes sense to me. I mean, I do think that if they bring back Berrios as that receiver number 4, and you're going to pay him $6 or $7 million, he's going to have a role in the offense. So if they bring him back, I think you look to the draft to go find that outside, that starting receiver, and then Cole can be your depth guy who brings you the blocking. I don't know. I don't see the answer being in free agency. I wish there was a more of a home run guy here. I think Amari Cooper is the closest thing. We'll see. I could see it happening, but given the depth at receiver in the draft, well, first of all, I would not be opposed to the Jets taking a receiver at 10, but I'm starting to to like the idea of the Jets taking a receiver at 35, doubling up on defense at 4 and 10, getting a pass rusher in Sauce if possible. And then if you could get a guy like Christian Watson or George Pickens or somebody like that at 35, you pair him with Moore, Corey Davis, your tight ends. I like that path maybe more than selling out, 20 million for an Amari Cooper, but there are certainly some names to keep an eye out for. Allen Robinson is the one that interests me just because I think he brings you that legitimate number one receiver ability that you just don't have on the roster right now. And I think Christian Kirk is intriguing. He's a dark horse maybe, but I worry about shelling out the type of money that I think he'll get for the type of production that we've seen. So
in terms of Berrios, I
ahead.
think the way that they plan out how to attack wide receiver will dictate what happens with Berrios, because I think if they decide that, okay, we're not going to get one of the big names and we don't want to go for a mid-tier 10 million or so kind of contract for Michael Gallup, Christian Kirk, whoever, then I think at that point because at that point then you're pivoting towards making wide receiver a high priority in the draft. So that you're probably going to draft someone and get that affordable contract to fill out your starting lineup. So I think at that point, then you could say, all right, let's get Braxton Berrios back. Even obviously you don't go to an absurd number, but if you can get him in that reasonable 5-6 million range, then I think that's when they could think about bringing him back. But if they do decide to bring in, make a free agency play with a more lucrative contract, then I think at that point, it probably wouldn't be the best investment to bring Berrios back as a fourth receiver, maybe even fifth. Once the draft rolls around, and you maybe add another guy in the later rounds, then you're also probably investing in tight end as well, and that guy is going to be getting some targets. So at that point, I'd probably say if they decide that they want to be aggressive with spending on wide receiver, I think they probably let Berrios walk. But if they decide let's punt on the free agent wide receivers, focus on the draft, then I think you have it makes more sense cap wise to get him back. But I agree with you. I think ultimately they're not going to make a move here, which is different than what I think I thought what I believe that I was picturing a few weeks ago. But with the expectation now that Godwin won't be there, that Calvin Ridley won't be available, I just don't see them making a huge move here. I think they have a nice pair of pieces in place with Moore and Davis. Elijah Moore has the potential to be that guy that we're looking for. He really does, with the way that he was playing his last few games before getting hurt. And when you think about that, he really could have been putting up those same numbers all year if Zach Wilson hit a few throws earlier on. He does have that upside, and they do have good options in the draft as well. So I think that they're going to pass on making a huge move here, ultimately re-sign Berrios and focus on the draft. That's my gut feeling right now. But there are a lot of good players on this market that they could go after if that's something that they feel like doing.
Yeah, I just think with how good the receiver classes have been in the draft, it just doesn't make sense to shell out a bunch of long-term money to a free agent receiver unless you really believe in them. And I just don't really see there's anybody on the market that I'd be comfortable doing that with. Godwin would be maybe the only one, and that's even with the injury. But outside of that, it's like, all right, you're already paying Corey Davis, who has been a bit underwhelming, if we're being honest. I like the guys in the draft, and I think 35 is a sweet spot. I think there's a good chance that one of those guys who you think isn't going to be there, like Elijah Moore last year, is going to fall. I just think, Traylon Burks had a bad 40 time. Maybe he falls. A guy like Chris Olave, I don't think he's going to fall to 35. But Jahan Dotson, Christian Watson's the guy I really like. But I just think there's a good chance that there's going to be a guy that you'd be really happy with starting for you at 35. So yeah, I don't see them shelling out big money. When I look at free agency as a whole, in terms of what do I think the Jets will do, if I had to make a few predictions, and Michael, I guess you could jump in here as well, or I guess predictions / what I would want them to do. I think one, they're going to make a move at guard. I think, for all intents and purposes, I'll say James Daniels. But I think even if they miss out on him, I think Laken Tomlinson or Corbett or Conor. Somebody makes sense. I think they're going to make a legitimate move at guard. That's not LDT. And I think they'll make the upgrade at center. I do think they're going to go out and get a guy like Ryan Jensen. So I think that's where you're going to see the most their money go at the start of free agency is center and guard. Then I think you go see him get a tight end. Hurst is the guy I like the most. And then maybe a safety like Marcus Williams. I think that's a somewhat realistic free agency class. I think then you look at maybe more of the depth guys, linebacker. Obviously, I like Devondre Campbell a lot. I'm going to avoid the thing where I think they're going to sign everybody. So maybe they don't sign Campbell, but they sign a Jayon Brown or Azeez Al-Shaair or somebody like that. I kind of don't think they're going to sign anybody at corner. Maybe a low level guy, but I kind of think they might just not sign anybody and then just draft one or two and just keep rolling with that strategy. But yeah, overall, and then I guess at running back, as far as a prediction, I say they'll sign a guy like a Raheem Mostert or somebody like that. But I think when you look at the free agency as a whole, you're going to see the biggest swing they took is going to be at center, guard, and tight end. I think that's where you're going to see them spend their money. And then I guess you can throw a little safety in there as well. Michael, what do you think?
So I think we're mostly on the same page. I think they'll make the biggest investments on the O-line and safety. So I agree with you there. And again, we don't know what is going to happen. It's not like they choose whether or not they sign Marcus Williams. I think they'll be in on Marcus Williams, but they might not get him. He's going to have multiple options.
And also, it's not the worst thing in the world to miss out on paying a safety,
right,
$14 million if he doesn't get it. Like,
yeah,
I'm
definitely,
actually not even that upset if they miss out on Williams and then they sign a guy like Diggs or Diggs is still going to get some money, or Tart or Reed or somebody like that. Like, I'm fine not if they miss out on Marcus Williams, as long as they just get somebody competent at safety.
Yeah, for sure. So either whether they get Marcus Williams or not, I think money's going to be spent there, and they'll get at least one good starter, potentially even two. Specifically, if they don't get Williams, I think there might be a greater chance you see a duo formed there of a couple of solid starters. But O-line, I think more so than safety, where it's kind of Marcus Williams in his own tier now that Jesse Bates is gone, or you could put Tyrann Mathieu out there. But O-line has a deeper pool of options, I think. So I think they have more control there over in the sense that if you want to make a big move, I think you absolutely can with a number of options. So I think definitely something will be done there. I personally don't think a center move will be done. It wouldn't surprise me. I think it's a possibility, but I'm going to predict that they're going to stick with McGovern, and I think they will fill that right guard spot before the draft with I would go with Daniels as my favorite prediction, but Tomlinson, Conor Williams, I think one of those three guys, and throw Austin Corbett in there. I would say one of those four guys is going to be the Jets starting right guard next year. So I think most of the money, safety, offensive line, those are where your two, maybe three big signings come. And tight end, I think we're going to see a couple of those mid-tier signings. Edge and corner, I think they'll probably just do something small to fill it out. Wide receiver, I think we'll re-sign Barrios, and that's about it. And then I think, defensive tackle, I think there will be a fairly substantial sign there, a mid-tier guy. And I think that's about it. We'll see. Probably a running back signed. Linebacker, I just don't see an addition coming at linebacker. I would like to, but I just don't see the signals pointing to it. So ultimately, I think that's how it plays out, keeping expectations realistic. Offensive line and safety, the biggest investments, and then at most other positions, just kind of finding the value and plugging holes where it makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think my prediction for this free agency is I don't think you're going to see necessarily the same splash as a signing like Carl Lawson. Or even I was going to say, or even a Corey Davis. So I think Carl Lawson was legitimately a splash free agent signing. It was a high priced.
Yeah.
You could make a case that Carl Lawson was a top 3 free agent in that class. I don't think they have that, but I still think you're going to see the Jets being aggressive and active. I think you're going to see I hate to say quantity over quality, but I think you're going to see a lot of free agent signings, but I don't think you're going to see maybe a huge one like a J.C. Jackson or an Amari Cooper. I don't think you're going to see the Jets in on that. But if they walk out of there with a Hayden Hurst, a James Daniels, and I'll say Quandre Diggs, like I'm happy with that. I think if they can find ways to fill a few of these key holes with good players, you have to be happy. And then you're set up with the draft with, 4 picks in the first 38 selections to really put your roster over the top. Devondre Campbell, the linebacker, is a guy that I really like. I'm hesitant to say that they'll sign a linebacker, Michael. I kind of feel like you that they might ignore it. Daniels seems like the type of guy that we'll get excited for, but he probably won't shake free of Chicago. But the good thing there, and just like Marcus Williams in New Orleans, although he'll shake free from New Orleans, but there's a lot of depth at both those positions. So I think even if the Jets miss out on one of those guys that you really like, there isn't much of an excuse for them not to sign a starting guard, a starting safety, and a competent tight end. I think there aren't really any excuses for them not to handle that. And then outside of that, then you have some money to make, to improve the depth of the roster and whatnot. But I'm really excited for this free agency class. I get the sense that maybe some Jets fans could end up being underwhelmed, especially if they don't land a James Daniels or Marcus Williams. But I think at the end of the day, you just have to look at how many good players do they add to this team. Because they have enough guys who have the potential to be superstars, like you said, like Elijah Moore, like hopefully a Zach Wilson or Michael Carter, and then you have these picks this year to hopefully bring in a guy like Sauce Gardner or Kayvon Thibodeau or whatever. What the Jets need is they need good players, and they need better depth, and I think that's what you're going to see them bring in this offseason. So Michael, I guess we'll wrap it up there. We'll do a mailbag that'll come out before free agency starts, and then we'll have a free agency podcast. I mean, it depends on the news breaks. If the Jets make some moves on Monday, we'll have a podcast drop Monday night. If nothing really happens, we'll wait until Tuesday night, and so on and so forth. So we'll plan that out. But you can follow us at CYJ Pod on Twitter. You can follow Michael at Michael_Nania, myself at Ben W. Blessington. Go to JetsXFactor.com for the best place to go for Jets content. Michael, any last thoughts?
I mean, I agree with what you just said. I think this is a free agency that's not going to be about the big splash names. Although, like we said, they could be on Marcus Williams, Dalton Schultz if he's available. And, these guards are going to get 8 figures per year. So they might make a substantial signing or two in that way. But try not to be underwhelmed because this team has a lot of holes. They're not going to fix them all in free agency. It would be impossible for them to. It's like you said, they have a lot of high ceiling talent in place, and they're going to add even more of it with 2 top 10 picks and 2 high second round picks. So it's just about complementing that young talent so those guys can be in the best position to become the core pieces long term. Put this team in position to compete for a wild card, play meaningful games so these guys can get meaningful reps and play in a scheme where they don't have to, whether it's the young corners having to play behind a pass rush that isn't that good, or the young linebackers having to play in a run defense where the defensive line isn't filling its gaps well, or Zach Wilson's having to throw to tight ends who can't catch. It's just about finding complementary pieces, filling out the roster, to minimizing the number of holes you have. Even if you're not filling those holes with amazing players, you don't need those guys to be amazing. Who you need to be amazing is Zach Wilson, is Elijah Vera-Tucker, Elijah Moore, Bryce Hall, Quincy Williams. These are the guys, and whoever you draft this year, those are the guys who need to be amazing. And in order to help them do that, you need to complement them with just guys who plug the holes, who have experience, fill their roles, and can put those young players in the best position to succeed. So I think that's what this free agency is mostly going to be about.
Yeah, I'm certainly excited for next week. I mean, this team will be built through the draft, but this is an important free agency class to really help bring the Jets out of the cellar. In my eyes, obviously the drafts are the most important for the long-term success. But if the Jets make a few key free agent moves, that's the difference between, 2 or 3 more wins when it comes down to it. The Jets have had some bad luck in the last few free agency classes, especially in terms of staying healthy. But you make the right signings in March, and I think it really can help you and your depth as you go through the season. So we'll be back next week. I guess our mailbag podcast will drop sometime this weekend. And then, as I said, we'll have podcasts at the beginning of next week. Michael, I guess that'll do it for us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great week. Excited for next week. Stay tuned with us. Stay tuned with Jets X Factor. Everybody have a good one.